This is the supplemental video for tints, shades, and tones. I want to briefly go over tints and shades again. We touched upon this in the last supplemental video. One thing to clarify is about the grading criteria. Meeting the criteria for this assignment would be to use that gradation method shown in the lecture where you create the gradation and just copy colors from the gradation and into your gradation scale here, the transitional steps. Exceeding the criteria would be to have a perfect transition where each of these transitional steps mathematically worked out to where they're basically, there's a little variation there. RGB values, which we have here down in our color scale, I'll allow variation usually between 1 and 2, maybe up to 3, but I want to see a very tight I don't want to see much variation there. We'll talk about this a little bit more in this video, but let's go ahead and briefly walk through this. Let's see if I have, let's go ahead and pick up the color, drop it in. We'll go ahead and do this. Should be brief, basically a recap for all of you. So I've got my magic wand tool. Go ahead and select this. This is a little bit different, so just giving you some options from what's shown in the lecture. You're welcome to use any method you want. Again, I'm using Photoshop because I feel it deals with color a little bit easier for some of you. But again, any way you prefer. So we have our colors filled in for each of our scales. So let's go ahead and start with our first transition. Remember, we have this kind of uneven transitional steps of 9. This is a 10-step scale. If you then to 11, it makes it a little bit easier, but that's, again, your choice. We go to our hue saturation tool, that control U, and our first step is 11 because we have that unevenness. And what I'm going to show you here is how this works out mathematically. And this is, I don't really need you to understand that, but I want you to understand that it does work differently than that other method that was shown using the gradation. And the gradation looks fine. Most people won't notice the difference. It isn't a problem in most applications, but there is a level of difference there that can be that some people will notice and can be detected, and that's something that I do want to talk about and I do want to express, and that's where we're talking about meeting criteria and exceeding criteria. And I don't feel that this takes any longer. This can be done very quickly, and it also doesn't have that step of removing and adding that extra part. So let's go ahead and just kind of finish this up. Again, I think that stroke here looks nice. I don't think it's necessary though. But I tend to add it, especially once you have that selected. And it doesn't necessarily need to be black either. It can just be your orange if you prefer. It can be a number of sizes. Just don't have it touch this next step. So what we're talking about, that mathematical application there, is if we go back to this different, let's go back to this file here. So let's go ahead and zoom in here so you can see this a little bit better, and I can post this file for you. And these are the changes I'm talking about, these RGB values. And basically when you're talking about white and RGB, you're talking about on a scale of 0 to 255. RGB values of white are 255 each. So in the case of orange, it has an RGB value of R255, G128, and B0. So you want these to increase equally to 255 across the board, and I have it listed here of what those steps require. Illustrator will deal with these decimal points. In Photoshop, you're going to deal with whole numbers. Makes it a little bit easier, and I can post this. But what's nice about the hue saturation tool is you don't really have to think about these numbers in this way. It's all done for you. It's automatic. It's very simple, but these can be detected, and we can identify them with the eyedropper tool, and it's something that you can mention in your critiques. It's the same thing if let's go back to this file. Same thing with the shades as well. You can see these decreases, and what's nice about the shades is when they're decreasing to 0, something like a B, which the blue, which is fixed at 0, stays at 0, and then in this case, you're just decreasing the red to 0 equally. So it's something we can talk about a little bit more for anyone that's interested. But at this point, I don't think it's essential that we get into these numbers that much, but it's something that this is how you exceed it. This is a very precise transition, whereas the other application is a little bit looser. It still meets the criteria. It's still a gradation. It's a little bit automated, and it's not as precise. This is very precise. There's no question to the accuracy of these transitional steps. So we can talk about that more if you're interested, but this is what we mean by meeting criteria, exceeding criteria. And I want to make that a very clear definition at this point in this class, because it's going to be essential as we move forward, this difference between meeting and exceeding criteria. So let's go ahead and skip the shades, because I think, at this point you should all be clear about it. This basically, instead of increasing the lightness, you're going to decrease the lightness here. It's the same basic process. I'll post this explanation of value file. It shows numerically what's going on there. I don't think it's any big secret at this point how these tools are different, but if we need to talk about it some more, I'll definitely go into that in more detail as necessary. So at this point, I've already done the saturation transition. This was talked about a little bit in the last supplement. So this is going to gray, and if we switch this image mode grayscale, we're going to see a change in value. Let's go ahead and flatten that. So they're getting darker, and that's what happens often when you do a transition into saturation. And you'll see that the same thing. He picked a middle gray in the video. It's not maintaining that constant value. Maintaining a constant value, but that's, it's meeting the criteria. To exceed the criteria, we want that fixed value to be constant. We want it to be precise, and this is where we start to pull in that grayscale slider. If we go to the explanation of tone, and actually I have it on this one, and it's a little bit better picture. And we can see here that numerically we can also work that out in RGB values. And at this point we can identify a gray. In this case, it's anytime all three RGB values are equal, it's either white, black, or gray. And in the case of white, it's 255, black is 0, and gray is any other numbers that are equal. But at this time, 166 is the same value as the orange. So if we go back to our template and then we undo this, we can go ahead and let me go ahead and select this, put our grayscale slider up in the color window so we can see it. We can bring up our hue saturation tool. We can check. Remember, when we pull up our hue saturation tool, we automatically pull up the eyedropper tool. We can see that it's 43% black. We can check our gray, which it switched it to 59% as we change the saturation, and as we adjust the lightness, we want to make it 43. And here you may get a little bit of variation. This is where, exceeding those, there's still a little bit of room that this is that tolerances that I allow, and I got 164 this time. Not a big difference. It's still within that range. But we change all of these values to meet that 43% black that we were looking for. So in this case, to exceed the values of the lighter and darker values, so let's go ahead and first off, let's go ahead and we'll start with the darker one, because I'd like to show you this one. I think it'll be a little bit easier for everyone to understand. Excuse me there, I forgot to switch this back to grayscale slider. So remember, you always want to check and make sure what your first one is. So in this case, it's coming at 48, which is awkward. And let me check why that is. Okay, so I had multiple layers still intact, and I was actually checking a different layer, so I already identified the problem with what was going on there. So that's something to keep in mind as we work with layers. I'll talk about the layers a little bit later. Typically, I will flatten the layers for you so I don't run into that issue, but that is something that you may experience. It's one of those reasons why I may ask you to submit your PSD files just to check to see if something's funny like that. We all run into it, and it's especially happens when I'm doing videos on the cuff that I may make that mistake. So not uncommon to see, especially, and it's good for you to see me do it because you'll run into it as well. We all do it from time to time. So 43% black, and we're gonna go darker. So let's say we'll go 4 because that's kind of an uneven. So we'll want to go 47 here. So let's go ahead and select our first one here, open it up. It's at 46, so we just need to go a little bit darker. So we'll move it to 47. So our next one's going to be 51. Check it, it's at 48, so we don't have to go much darker. And this would be exceeding the criteria. And this is very precise change in value. This is really exceeding. This is really pushing the envelope of exceeding. I really don't expect many of you to go this far, but I will be very impressed by those that do this. And this will be looking definitely later in the course. I will be looking to see this kind of level. For the most part, if some of you kind of have a general trend, I'll be looking. Exceeding will be a trend as long as all of them are heading darker. I'll be happy at that. That'll be fine. Meeting the criteria is as long as it's going dark at the end. But for exceeding the criteria, I will want to see a general trend of going darker. And then for the ones that are lighter, I want to see a general trend. If it's going darker than lighter, that will not be meeting the criteria. And just to make that clear. So at this point, just to kind of recap where we're at, we're going 43, we're going 47, 51, 55, 59. So see that trend, it's an even transition of going darker. Let's go ahead and finish this out. We have time. So 59 was this, so we're going to go to 63. That's a little too dark. And you'll notice how much nicer this will look compared to some of the other ones. And we'll look at it compared to this one, which is kind of uneven. So we're going to go to 67 here. And I really want to take the time because this will really add to your presentation later on to have something that's this specific in an application. So 71. This will be 75. And you may need to write these down. If you do, I mean, that's fine. I've been doing this for a while, so it's not too hard to keep some of these basic numbers in mind. And this last one here is going to be 79. And you'll notice all the tools are doing all the work for me. These are just some basic numbers. I'm counting by 4, not too hard, very basic math that we're using here, but writing it down can be helpful, and also keep track, especially if you're doing, a sequence of 20 or 30 transitions. It can be helpful and useful to do that. But notice how much cleaner. This is getting darker, but this is a much nicer transition in my mind. And if we go to image mode grayscale, I think you'll see it a little bit even better. I think this is a much nicer transition. This is a little bit more uneven. If we check it with the eyedropper tool, we'll see it's increasing by 2 here, 2 here. We have a 3 here, and then 2, and it's staying within 2 or 3, but it's not quite as regular. Here we have this really nice dark transition, and it's very clear that it's intending to get darker. This is getting darker, but it just doesn't have that same. This is clearly intending to be darker. There's no question about it. Where something, in this case, I've lightened this one, but I haven't changed this other one. You can see here that this is irregular. This is going from dark to light, and that would be not keeping with the intentions of the assignment. So that would be, an issue that we'd want to be addressed. So hopefully that's clear at this point. If it's not, let me know. Please let me know if you have questions about that. But that's the difference between meeting the criteria and exceeding the criteria. We want to have that perfection of, using that hue saturation tool to have these nice transitions, or you can meet the criteria by using that gradation and then having, which can be quicker for some. I don't find that it's quicker, but that may be just because of practice and repetition of doing it. Either way, it's up to you what you want to do, but let me know, make some comments which way you went, and then we can kind of talk about it during the discussion. And of course, if you have any other questions, let me know those as well. Thanks.